So, as was mentioned, the nice thing about completing the square is it's always going to work. Someone brought up the what if there's something in front of the x squared? That's a very good question. Well, all you would do in your first step is just divide everything by 2, and then you can follow the same process. So it's going to work for any equation of the type something's x squared, w squared, whatever, plus a something x, and then plus a constant. And now the other thing I'm going to show you called the quadratic formula, that's also true. So both of these are very valuable because they always work. If you're doing a problem with an x squared and you've tried simple factoring, you've tried factor by grouping, it's just not seeming to work out, use one of these formulas. It's great, you'll get an answer for x every time, assuming you plug in the things correctly. So does anyone happen to know what the quadratic formula is? I feel like it's something that's drilled into a lot of high schoolers' brains for some reason.
Yeah, isn't it like negative b plus or minus the square root of b minus 4ac over 2a?
B squared?
D squared. And now something that I did in high school way back when, maybe not that way back, I'm not that old, is I kind of lost sight of what we're doing here because it's easy to do that, right? We have this b and b squared and square roots flying around, or we're dividing by something and a lot of things are going on. But really this formula is what we've been doing in this whole section. We want to solve for x. We have something equal to 0. We're solving for x. So don't lose sight of that. Once we plug in all of our things, once we do our order of operations, then we get an answer for x that once we plug into this equation, we would get a final solution. And just so we have it as a reference point, there is that thing I've been mentioning multiple times, and I think I did actually write it down the first day. Is that anytime we have something of this form, we like to write it as, we call this the general form of. Now we can identify our b. We did that with completing the square. Whatever is in front of our x squared is our a, and whatever is our constant term is our c. So the nice thing about the quadratic formula is that once you find these things, it's not really a process anymore. You don't have to remember of, oh, what's the next step? I got to find b, and now I got to find b over 2, and all of these things. Like, this is very process heavy. It's a difficult process. There's a lot of steps going along, but my brain isn't good at memorizing things. It's just how it works. And so that's the downside of this, is that you have to memorize a formula and then you kind of get lost in the why you're doing this, right? It's kind of hard to see, oh, obviously, if I do all of these things, I'll get an answer for this. Actually, the proof's not terrible, but that is lost sight, where here it does kind of make sense along the way. You've been solving for x the entire time, and you can kind of backtrack. But all of that's a long-winded way of saying that I like this a lot more. Almost everyone else seems to like this one more. And I think on the first test, I'll ask you to do one or the other, but in general, you can, once you certainly get beyond this course, you can kind of say, I like the quadratic formula. I'm going to stick with that one versus the other. Okay, so let's do this problem. So what is my B? What is my A? What is my C? Well, let's start with what's my A for this question? 2. Yes, sorry, 2. What's my B?
-1.
-1.
And what's my C?
-12.
Now, let's say hypothetically, let's say that I gave you an equation like this. I'm not going to do a full equation, but let's say I gave you that. What's my C in that case? So my A would still be 2, my B would still be -1. What's my C?
Would it be 0 since you don't have one?
Yes, yeah. So if you're missing a value, if you're missing an x squared, which you wouldn't really use the quadratic formula if that was the case, or you're missing an x or you're missing a constant, that means it's 0. It's there, but it's being multiplied by 0. Just something to be aware of. Great. And beyond that, well, now I just throw everything into this formula. I know what my b is. It's -1. It's a good idea to be very careful with your parentheses because there's a lot of negatives flying around. B is also -1. A is 2. C is -12. And A is 2. And now, honestly, I guess maybe it'd be a little bit difficult for someone in elementary school, but you probably learn your order of operations in elementary school. And that's all we're doing at this point. We have to make sure we're using PEMDAS. And so what's going to be kind of my first step when solving for x in this equation?
Just kind of simplify the terms. So I guess first would be -1 squared.
Okay.
Which must be 1. And then you just kind of do that with the rest of the terms as well. So that you can put it all together.
Yeah, and that's interesting, worth mentioning. When I have this square root, that's really doesn't seem to show up in PEMDAS, but it's actually a parentheses. Everything under the square root is the first thing we're supposed to deal with using PEMDAS. And so inside of that, well, yeah, okay, now we can use our exponent. So -1 squared is just 1. And then I multiply. 4 times 2 is?
-8.
And -8 times -12 is?
96.
Positive or negative?
Positive.
And then I just add those two terms together. Actually, I want to write out those steps for people taking notes. So this guy over here. Great, next step.
Add what's in the root. So it'll be 97.
It's weird that it's just deciding to change sides randomly. Size
You can
randomly.
also rewrite that -1 as just a 1, right?
Sure, why not, right? If we're being very strict about following the order of operation, we should write those as 2 separate steps. You guys are probably well versed enough to know that that's not really going to affect my answer. So that's good. And also with the bottom as well. I don't know, I think this would be 4th down the line, but whatever. It's not going to really affect my final answer. And in fact, this is my final answer. As always, well, not as always. As we mentioned here, if this is a nice square root, figure out what that is. Do 1 plus or minus the, I don't know if it's like 2. Figure that out, divide by 4, subtract, divide by 4. Quite often when we're doing quadratic formula, this is what it boils down to. And so you can just stop. And kind of rewinding to the beginning of class, I mentioned, oh, look at this weird form that seems like, why does that show up? Well, that shows up a lot when we're solving these quadratics. We usually have a number plus or minus a square root over something. Of course, it is a nice thing, but typically it's not super nice. And so that's going to be your final answer. And now if this were an application question, if I was saying, I don't know, this equation is used to model the height of a football or whatever. Yes, I would want you to throw this in your calculator and say it's, I don't know, 12 feet above the ground. But if it's not asking you that, if we're not in an application question, this is what I prefer. I prefer exact answers, even if it's a gross square root, even if it's a gross fraction. I like these better than decimals because then if I'm grading your test and you give a weird decimal, I can't see where you made your mistake. Where here, it's very broken up and I can see where a mistake would happen. And also it's just exact. the sense of pure math. Any questions? Great. So just as a roadmap over the next couple of periods, yes, we're behind, but we also had the, I'll go over that next time. That's not too long. But we had that short day of, or missing the day of MLK. We are going to go into radical equation. So this is 1.5. So if you've watched that video already, great. If you haven't watched it yet, it's worth a watch. Something worth mentioning is, I think in the last, I don't know, it's pretty long actually. The last 7 or 8 minutes, I go through an equation that has a square root on both sides. That is terrifying and more difficult than anything we'll see in our class. So you won't see that here. I think maybe I put one on the worksheet just for fun, but we won't see anything like that on the exam. So if you get overwhelmed with that slide, I in fact take up an entire PowerPoint slide and almost like probably 3 columns. You don't really need to worry about that part. And then we're going to get into chapter 2, which ideally we're going to complete 2 additional sections next class period. I know sounds terrifying, but one of them is finding the midpoint in distance. So that will take 5 minutes. And some of it should be review of how do you find the equation of a line, or how do you graph a line. So we're going to be a little bit behind at the end of next class period, but I honestly don't think we'll be that far behind. So if you're curious what videos would be a good idea to watch, definitely 1.5, maybe skip the last, I don't know, however many minutes it is when I have 2 square roots on both sides. This one's a short video because distance and midpoint is easy. And then 2.2 intercepts and symmetry is not too bad either. I'd be surprised if we got into lines. If we do, it's just going to be on the surface. And I promise that once we start to get on a good pace, I will start letting you guys out early, because it's a little bit difficult or unfair to give you, geez, talking's hard. Okay, it's a little bit unfair to expect you guys to watch videos and stay the whole class period. So it's going to be a bit, we need to get kind of back on schedule, but once we are on schedule, I promise you, you're not going to be like, oh, I have to watch 40 minutes of videos outside of class and then he holds us 20 minutes after. You're going to start to have classes where we say, okay, well, we're feeling good with the concepts, we've done the practice, you guys can go 15 minutes early. So promise that'll be a thing in the near future. Since I'm going to put you in breakout rooms, I'm going to leave you in breakout rooms for the last, I don't know, we only have 8 minutes left in class. So are there any questions before I put you in those rooms? Great. And just so we're all on the same page, same worksheet 1.3 part 2, make sure you submit that assignment. Make sure you submit any of the previous assignments if you've forgotten to. I get it. There's a lot of stuff to take from day 1. And then, I don't know, complete 2 of these. If you complete more, great. If you only really get through 1, oh no, did I do the same problem again? No, that's different. Right? Nope, it's the same thing. So, well, I guess skip the first one. I need to be more careful about that. Do 8 and 9, and once you've done 8 and 9, you can go ahead and head out. If you really only focus and make sure you're comfortable with 8, that's fine as well. Just submit that as well. Let's do as much as you can. And then I have office hours after class today. So if you need any extra help or have any questions, then I'll be here. I might leave for a minute or 2 and then come back just to get the recording saved. Cool. Oh, and email me about group references. Don't forget that. Super important. Can't emphasize that enough. Okay, breakout rooms.